I haven't always been this small. I also have some unsettled business with Scream. In front of the castle, Mr. Hatman pulled a small key out from his coat, and Linda was wondering if the keyhole on the door isn't far too big for that little key. Mr. Hatman grins to Linda and fetches a brush from the other pocket and paints the key to an apple and the lock on the door to a lion head in copper. He then fed the apple to the lion, who opened the door. I don't want anyone to know how to open the door, so you better keep my secret. This is a check-in castle. No one ever leaves the same way they came in, and it could become a matter of life or death if the key to the key would be stolen, he said. Magnus entered the magnificent hall first and stopped in front of a mirror. This is huge. This must be the biggest mirror I've ever seen, he said. Magnus followed the ornaments around the mirror with his finger and saw that they depicted the story about Karen, the snake dragon. Why don't you test it? Mr. Hatman asked. Magnus felt like a curious child and couldn't hide his enthusiasm. What do you mean? Mr. Hatman walked up to the mirror and swung a brush again. Are you hungry? He asked, and started to splash paint on the mirror. The colors moved like a swirl inside. Friends, what would you like to eat? Linda answered first because she had been hungry since they ran out of school earlier that day. Chicken. I love chicken, she said. The colors inside turned to a thick, grayish, swirling smoke. First, the vortex seemed to become a deep hole in the mirror. Then it turned the other way and pointed outward. All of a sudden, the center of the vortex squeezes out a freshly grilled chicken into Linda's hands. I want apple pie, Magnus shouted, with extra custard sauce. And I want steak, Mr. Hatman shouted even higher, and they all started to laugh. Mr. Hatman suddenly stopped eating and looked at the young couple seriously, just to get up and run into another room. Magnus and Linda could hear him move things around. He was quite strong for his size. Then he returned with big, heavy blankets. Why not make it comfortable right here on the floor, now that we're having fast food for dinner and such a pleasant time? He said, and they started laughing again. They settled for the night on the floor with their backs against the mirror and with the blankets warming them. Mr. Hatman took one of his old brushes, pretended to dip it in paint, and splashed some out on the cold stone wall. Linda was equally amazed every time he used his brushes. There was really no paint on the brushes, but he painted with all colors in the world. The bricks turned into a crackling log fire, and the heat spread around the castle. Linda leaned against Magnus, who took a last piece of apple pie. Then they both fell asleep, still sitting in the main entrance of the castle. Mr. Hatman smiled and looked secretive. It's just before midnight, and the little old man took a step into the mirror. A few seconds later, a tall man walks out instead. He kneels in front of the sleeping two, smiles and says, "Good night, my son." Then Mr. Hatman left the grand hall. The morning light radiated from the windows high up in the castle walls and down on the sleeping children. The fire had gone out, and the comforting heat had become lukewarm. Linda woke up and felt she was a bit cold. She cuddled up to Magnus, who woke up. Where did the Hat Man go? He asked Linda. Linda shrugged her shoulders and looked around. She realizes that they actually haven't seen more of the castle than the entrance hall. Should we take a look around? She asked Magnus curiously. Magnus felt the same intriguing curiosity. When they arrived at the castle, it was dark outside, and it didn't seem to be much to the world on the inside. Now, as the sun was filling the castle and light beams sprinkled in everywhere, he discovered that the hall was huge and the walls were filled with tapestries and paintings. Why on earth did we sleep in the main hall? He said, and laughed. Linda saw all the nicely carved dark red wood that made the pillars and the wooden railings along the stairs. In front of them, a lovely couch looked inviting. Why didn't we sleep in that instead? She said, pointing at the couch, and laughed. On each wall, portraits hung of people Magnus never saw before, and wondered why there were no enchanted images there as in Harry Potter. Suddenly they heard the castle gates open and the door to the main hall. Mr. Hatman entered whistling a melody. Good morning, good friends. Have you slept well? Magnus and Linda hurried back to the hall. The castle is so big, Magnus said. Mr. Hatman spun cheerfully around. Still friends, you've only seen a fraction of it. Linda started to object, thinking about the Hat Man's size again, but she saw in his eyes that this is not the right time to talk about his size again. Choose which room you want for yourself. You can take any one at all. There are girls' rooms and boys' rooms. How do I know which is which? Linda said. All furniture looks much alike, very stylish and very matching. The Hat Man lowered his eyebrows and stared at Linda again. Because when you're in a room you choose for yourself, dear friend, it will be a girl's room if that is what you like. Mr. Hatman continued whistling on his song and left them alone again. Make yourself at home! Make yourself at home! They heard Mr. Hatman shout from somewhere in the castle. A storm is coming. Linda chose a room that had a wallpaper with big, pale, pinkish flowers, an enormous closet, and a huge bed with a carved wooden frame. The pattern looked like a news story, like the one with Karen in the frame on the hall mirror. My bed also has a carved story in it, Magnus hollered in excitement across the hall. Magnus's entire room was mostly made of wood, except for a copper head above the bed, almost like the one on the front door. When Magnus turned around, Linda stood in the doorway already, pale enough to match the flowers on her bedroom wall. What is it? Magnus asked worriedly. Linda just stared in front of her, then turned around like a zombie. She walked through the hall and down the stairs. Stop! What are you doing? Where are you going? Linda, stop! Magnus tried to run after her and finally caught her sleeve. What is wrong with you? Linda looked at Magnus and he could see a tear rolling down her cheek. Can you open the door? Linda asked and sounded mechanical. Why? Not until you tell me what's wrong. Linda headed to the front door and stopped in front of it. I just need to breathe. Mr. Hatman, Hatman, Magnus called at the top of his lungs and hoped that Mr. Hatman would hear him and come as quickly as he could. Magnus doubted that Linda was needing air, but he didn't know what was wrong, so even if he was getting a very bad feeling about all this, he opened the door. As if a wild sandstorm swept through the house, the draft sucked Linda out into the courtyard. Magnus tried to grab her, but his hand slipped. When the dust had settled and Magnus could see what was happening, he understood the bad feeling he just had. A loud laugh cut through the courtyard and returned an echo from the house. Magnus turned around surprised. The main hall was gone. The mirror, the wooden carvings, the old beautiful furniture, everything was gone and the castle looked abandoned. Magnus walked out on the stone stairs and closed the door behind him. He was shocked and didn't understand what just happened. If I open it now, all will be normal, he thought. But Magnus found that someone or something must have locked it from the inside when he closed the door. He was locked out? He slowly turned around again and saw Linda with a hand around her neck. The fingers on the hand reached all the way around her neck. Magnus got a chilling feeling in his stomach. Scream, he said, and got tunnel vision. He couldn't see anything else but Linda and the hand around her neck. From the settling dust, the shadow creature grew clear. Scream had tied her dark brown hair tight in the neck. On her shoulders, over her black long dress, a white collar rested strictly. Magnus thought she looked like a governess from a weird sect. Her face was pale, her lips bluish-red, and her eyes were just like black empty hollows. Magnus saw Scream tighten her grip around Linda's neck. "Let her go!" he screamed. He was so scared he felt his knees tremble. "Let her go!" Scream just stood there staring at Magnus, holding Linda in such a tight grip around her neck that Linda was turning blue. Magnus heard something behind him and saw in the corner of his eyes Mr. Hatman coming up from the steep stairs in the mountain. "I told you that you can't go out the same way you go into the castle. I told you." Magnus was still too afraid to move. In front of him, Scream stood, choking his paralyzed girlfriend and breathing so heavily it made him think of a furious bull that was staring at him without eyes. Mr. Hatman hid behind Magnus and pushed a couple of paintbrushes into his hand. "Attack her and stick the brushes in her empty eye sockets." When Magnus heard the order, he became so nauseous he made a burping sound and almost threw up. This triggered Scream, who let the grip of Linda's neck go and ran charging like an animal across the yard to attack Magnus, and she screamed. The scream was so disturbingly high it made Magnus lose his balance and cover his ears. He had never in his life heard something so painful. Mr. Hatman tore the paintbrushes back from Magnus and ran equally fast as Scream on his small legs. He threw out color droplets that stuck in midair, on which he quickly ran up. He made a jump against her, and when she couldn't fend him, he showed the paintbrushes straight into her eye sockets. With the sound of a dull implosion, Scream vanished into thin air and left a cloud of gray and black dust after her. Magnus ran out on Castle Courtyard and picked Linda up in his arms. The color had returned to her cheeks, and while Magnus carried Linda back, she gave him a warm hug. "Thank you for saving me," she said. Magnus felt a bit embarrassed. "It wasn't me. It was Mr. Hatman that saved you." Linda hugged Magnus even harder. "No, you locked yourself outside for me,"